Good morning, everyone. We are back for the fourth day of our academic week. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Dattesh Parulekar back to a second International Relations academic week with us. Dattesh Parulekar is an assistant professor of International Relations and Strategic Studies at the School of International and Area Studies in Goa University. His acquired areas of specialization include Indian foreign policy, Chinese political geopolitics, Eurasian and West Asian security, strategic maritime geopolitics, African affairs, and Latin American affairs. A former Fulbright Fellow, he completed his doctoral research in the domain of conflict management and resolution, with a research stint at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., the United States. He is a visiting faculty at various national defense institutions, such as the Naval War College in Goa, the National Defense College in New Delhi, the College of Defense Management, and the College of Air Warfare in Secunderabad, the Defense Services Staff College in Wellington, Tamil Nadu, the Military Institute of Technology in Pune, the Army War College in Mhow, the Indian Naval Academy in Izamalai, among others. He also teaches courses on India's foreign policy, geopolitics, and maritime security and strategy at prestigious institutions like the Indian Institute of Management and the Rashishta Rashka University, respectively. So, Professor, we are very glad to have you here this morning, and we would like to thank you for accepting our invitation back to our academic week. Professor, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and wonderful to be back, as you said, for the second year running, for this very important academic week that you have, because it's always a pleasure for me to speak to young audiences who are very curious about what's happening in the world. So today, the brief that I have with me is to talk about India-China engagement. This is a topic that is very exciting for many people in the region where I come from. But I'm happy to know that even far away in Brazil, this topic is definitely gaining a lot of interest. Because I believe that if there are any two countries whose relations are most critical, not just for these two countries, but for the world at large, it is India and China. So we can move to the first slide and I will tell you why. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. India and China, we all understand, are two large landmasses in terms of their geography. But what also makes them very interesting, interlocutors, is that these are two countries with very young demographies. The people in these two countries are much younger, and therefore the future of these countries lies ahead of them. It's unlike, let's say, Europe, where everyone talks about how Europe is in the sunset, because Europe is having a huge problem in terms of its young population. The same applies to countries like South Korea and Japan. They have larger GDPs than India, but clearly they don't have the future ahead of them, and the same also happens for Russia. Similarly, these two countries, India and China, are also civilizational states. Both India and China have very vibrant civilizational background that can go back 5,000 years. And if you read the history, in history, if you go back many, many centuries, Indian and Chinese scholars have often interacted, they have got into discourse, they have talked about various issues. So these are civilizational states that have been in constant interaction in past times. Both countries today and over the last few decades, they represent contrasting ways of organizing society. The Chinese success stems from command and control economy. It's an economy that has, communism in its political blood, but everything apart from that is capitalist. So it's a capitalist kind of a system which is run through a command and control structure. And everyone and the Chinese try to tell everyone that that's the only way to succeed. But then you have an India, almost the same, in fact, more population than China, sits next to China, is a functioning democracy, not a democratic dysfunction, and which shows you that you can rise at 6 to 7% economic growth, as India is doing right now, and it's the fastest growing major economy in the world today, and it's doing that through its federal democracy. You in Brazil are a federal democracy, we in India are a federal democracy as well. And we understand the compulsions that come from a federal democratic structure, but India shows that you can excel even by being a democracy. India China history is very different to the history of others. Our conflict is effectively a land border conflict. If you look at China's conflicts with other countries, China has issues with Japan in what is called as the East China Sea, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. China has issues with Taiwan, which is basically the cross trade problem. China has multiple disputes in the South China Sea with Southeast Asian countries. But all of those are countries with whom China does not share a land border. It only has a maritime border. Unlike that, with India, China does not share a maritime border, China shares a land border, and a large land border. And it is this land border that has been a frozen conflict for a long time. But 5 years ago, when COVID struck us, we had a limited skirmish on the border where India and Chinese forces went into some kind of a limited attack on each other, lost soldiers on both sides, but it wasn't a full-blown conflict. So this must be kept in mind. China has borders with almost 14 countries around it. Central Asian countries, North Korea shares a border, Mongolia shares a border, Russia shares a border. These are also land borders. But then these are not land borders which are being disputed. None of these countries are disputing a land border with China, including Russia, which in fact signed the land border agreement back in 2004. So the only continuing land border dispute that China has is with India, and this factor must be kept into mind when we are discussing Sino-Indian engagement. Let's be very clear about this. I know many in India want to see India and China as equals, including myself, but I'm a realist, and a realist has to go where the data takes him. It's very clear that there is no parity in terms of our current level of development. China clearly has stepped it up. They are a $19 trillion economy. We are a $4.5 trillion economy, so we are one-fourth of China. China's per capita income, which is the average income of a ordinary Chinese, is about 11 to 11.5 thousand US dollars. In India, it is under 3,000 US dollars. So again, we are like almost one-fourth of them. But more than that, it is the ability of China through its industrial power, the ability of China through its infrastructural power, the way it builds infrastructure, the ability of China to modernize its military because it has deep pockets. It's got huge amount of money. It's sitting on a lot of surplus, a lot of foreign exchange reserve. That's what gives China the kind of domination that India has to aspire to reach. And I'll give you a very interesting indication here. When India and China became independent, India in 1947 and China in 1949, China's economy was smaller than India. In 1979, when China embarked on economic reforms, China's economy was still smaller than India in terms of size. In 1991, India started economic reforms, 12 years later than China. Even at this time, both economies were on level pegging. So till 1991, China had not crossed India economically. India was still the larger economy. It's only since 1991 till 2025, and mostly in the 21st century, that China has just gone, like this. And it's gone from being just an economy of the equal size of India to now being able to outpace India 4:1. So let's keep this in mind when we look at the relationship. The Chinese worldview, which of course comes from their own civilizational understanding, is called Tianxia, which is all under heaven. While India's, civilizational understanding is formulated as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now, what is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam? Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam means Kutumba is a family and Vasudhaiva is the world. So India, when it hosted the G20 2 years ago, before Brazil, of course, India's mantra for the G20 was Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is one universe, one earth, and one family. Okay, so India believes in the collective, best tendencies of the world, whereas China says Tianxia, which is all under heaven, and that heaven effectively is a Chinese heaven. So for China, they are the instructors and the world follows them. So it's a very hierarchical kind of view. For India, it's a very lateral view that everybody sits together, everyone learns from each other, and that's how we become a better world. So these are the two different characteristics of our worldviews. There's no doubt China has made stellar achievements, and India too has many sound outcomes, particularly in the technological space. You can see that a lot of things are talked about China, but India has also done a lot of technological things, which hopefully I'll be able to speak about a little bit. But there is a problem. When you talk about infrastructure, whether it's hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure, people are always concerned about these three words. Where's the trust? Can I trust this, what you're offering it to me? Is there integrity in what you're offering? And what is your intent? These are very important words. What is the intent behind your technology? Is it to control me, or is it to help me flower and flourish? If I use your technology, can I trust that my privacy is going to be protected, that my data is going to be protected, or am I going to get compromised by the use of your technology? And this is the question people are asking, that look, Chinese technology is fabulous. I myself use certain aspects of Chinese technology. I go to China very often. But the fact is, I'm very much aware that there is the flip side to it. India delivers outcomes on technology as well. As I said, I will speak about it. But the good thing is, nobody till today has ever asked India, can I trust your technology? In the sense, is there integrity in the technology? Is there ethicality in the technology? I'll give you one example. Just 10 days ago, President Macron hosted the AI Action Summit in Paris. That summit was co-hosted by France with India. China was also present. Why was China not made a partner, and why it was not co-chaired with China? After all, China has much bigger technological advancement than India has done. But why was India chosen? Because Prime Minister Modi and President Macron both said, we are not just for innovation, we are also for preservation of the human spirit. So while we want technological innovation, that innovation must not compromise basic ethics, basic integrity, and basic trust factor. Now we are seeing China's techno-nationalism, economic protectionism. These are the things they do. They protect their industry as vis-a-vis foreign industry. Tech nationalism. Just 3 days ago, Xi Jinping met with all the tech entrepreneurs, and he's told them, Chinese technology must not slip out of China. It must not go to the outside world. Nobody should be able to, have technology transfer when it comes to China. Compare that with India. So China is a self-interested player. No harm. It's a country that wants to see itself as great. But my point is, India wants to see itself as great, but India also wants to see other countries emerge as great countries as well. And that's why when India offers its technology, India does not put any conditionalities. And I will talk about it a little later. So it's the whole idea of being a responsible actor and a stakeholder. During the pandemic, we saw how China reacted. China refused to allow the WHO to go and investigate as to how did the virus come. Was it part of a scientific inquiry, or was it simply coming out of the zoonotic animals? We don't know. Now we are told it's a leak from the lab. But China was not transparent. Whereas India has always been transparent about what it does and is willing to share data. Recently, we had a very big achievement, which is our rover, the Gaganyaan it's called. Our rover went on the moon. And the first thing and it happened when the BRICS summit was happening. So the Brazilian president, President Lula, complimented Prime Minister Modi, President Putin did, everyone did. What was the first statement of Prime Minister Modi? Whatever data we get from the moon, we will share with the world. We will not keep it only for India. Because whatever we learn about the moon, it is important for us on Earth. And we are not going to say, oh, it was our rover, so only we will have the information. All developing countries can have that information. India will share it. If you look at China, China is not invited to many forums. China is not part of the G7 plus. Now just understand this. The G7 is a grouping of industrialized countries. That's how they describe them. China is definitely more industrialized than India. They have fast trains, they have urbanized cities, and they're in a different level. There's no doubt about it. India is playing catch up, but doing it. Then why is it that China is not invited ever to the G7 as a G7 plus member? But India, for the last 7 years, is being invited for every forum of the G7 as a G7 invitee. China is more industrialized, but India gets invited because the G7 has said, for us, what matters, apart from other things, is democracy. And India is a democracy and a rising democracy. China is a rising country, but is not a democracy. So China, and if you see India, India is part of so many frameworks, which are actually contrary and paradoxical to each other. If you see the G7 has a particular agenda, the BRICS has a particular agenda, the Quad has a particular agenda, which is India, Australia, Japan, and United States. The RIC is Russia, India, China. G20 has a certain agenda. G7 has a certain agenda. India is part of all this and can easily be part of all this because for India, we are never about blocks and ideology. We're always about working with everyone. So we work with the Western industrialized nations. We work with Brazil, as we did in the G20 last year as a handover chair, because we wanted to see Brazil succeed as a G20 member. We work with the BRICS countries. We work with Russia. We work with South Africa. We work in the Quad to keep China honest. But we also work with Russia and China because there are issues of global governance where America dominates in an unjust manner. So that's India's ability to be able to straddle various domains without having any problem. And lastly, all those things that I've mentioned, political expression, diplomatic socialization. I know how you make diplomatic friends. How do you integrate economically? What are the attributes that go into building infrastructure? How do you do security cooperation? How do you share technological innovation? How do you go and find strategic resources in the world? And how do you bring about South-South collaboration? In all of these areas, China has a particular approach, India has a particular approach, and therefore that makes the India-China engagement or the India-China equation that much more exciting in the world. Next slide, please. Right. So I wanted to put this slide across because, coming out of Latin America and Brazil, and by the way, as somebody who has worked on Latin America as well for many years and traveled to Brazil, Argentina, and many other countries very frequently, I have been a strong votary that why is it that Latin America is left out of the Indo-Pacific? Of course, Brazil is not a Pacific Latin American country, but I'm talking here as a region. When we say Indo-Pacific, it means you are combining the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Then why is it that the Indo-Pacific for most countries in the world is the eastern part of Africa, as you can see there in blue? It starts from there, goes all across South Asia, goes all across East Asia, Southeast Asia, but then seems to go upwards towards the United States and Canada, but does not go straight so as to include a Mexico, a Peru, a Colombia, or for that matter, Chile. Why? Why is Latin America left out? What's the reasoning here? No real reasoning, but unfortunately, this is the problem. Anyway, so the most important region of the world is this. You can see it as a triangle. India at the top, Australia on one side, and South Africa on the other. So this entire water bodies that you see and these nations that you see, they hold the critical crux in the world today. That's why my title says the Indo-Pacific is the new ground zero, but the Indian Ocean region is the crux. This is Indian Ocean region, right? Now just look at India and look at India's maritime geography. India's maritime geography is one of the most blessed you can ever think of. 7,600 kilometers of coastline. 14 of India's provinces, that means half of India in terms of its states, are either maritime oriented or are actually in the maritime domain. India has an exclusive economic zone of 2 million square kilometers, which puts it in one of the largest water bodies in the world. But unfortunately, India did not do enough in early decades after independence to grow its maritime muscle. And so India today is again playing catch up, trying to develop that maritime orientation today that it used to have centuries ago, but somewhere down the line, British colonization made it forget the maritime domain. Because the British always told us, focus on that country in green, Pakistan, okay, after 47, and focus on that country that you don't see, but it's in gray, which is China, to the top, northeast. So focus on these two countries. Keep fighting China on the border. Keep fighting Pakistan on the border. But actually, what we see today, China is not pushing India on the border. The biggest threat, and I'm saying this with all honesty and responsibility, the biggest threat that comes to India is not from the land borders with China. The biggest threat that comes to India and India's security, economy, polity, etc., it comes from its maritime domain. China is very much growing in the maritime domain of India. Now, you might be wondering how come? I mean, how come China reaches here? And that's going to be my point. So let's move to the next slide, please. Just keep this map in mind as you go along. Now, look at this. 50% of India's export GDP, that means whatever is India's export GDP, 50% of it moves to the east of India. Now, what is the east of India? The east of India is Japan, South Korea, Singapore. That's the east of India. The west of India is Africa and West Asia. So 50% of India's export is to its east. So India needs to get more involved in the maritime dynamics of its east. It has to do much more because that's where the trade is. It has to secure its trade. But 20% of its overall trade goes through what is called as the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And the Red Sea and the Suez Canal is to India's west. And basically, Suez Canal belongs to Egypt. And it basically, the Suez Canal is important because it connects Asia with Europe, right? So 50% of our GDP moves east, but 20% of overall trade, and this is more export and import, goes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So for India, its maritime domain is extremely important, and it cannot allow a foreign entity, no matter what, to come and dominate this area. Because if this area is dominated, then India's core interests are going to be insecure. But what about China? China also has its problems. China's 80% of its oil imports come from what is called as the Malacca Straits. And the Malacca Straits is basically what separates Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia. It's a small strip of water, but it's one of the most busiest shipping lanes in the world. 80% of China's oil comes from there. So if there is any action against China in the Malacca Straits, China is going to be goose. China is going to have huge problems. So China also has certain insecurities that makes it come into the Indian Ocean. India also wants to be in the Pacific Ocean because 50% of its trade is there. So basically what is happening is India is moving east and China is moving west. China wants to be in the Indian Ocean where its oil and its merchandise and everything comes from, and it's not an Indian Ocean power. India wants to be in the Indian Ocean, but India also wants to be in the Pacific to guard its trade. Now, what happens is the two countries, having been maritime states for centuries, they're very ambitious, and fair enough. And so they basically have these two visions. China's vision is called the Maritime Silk Road, and it basically connects, eastern China all through the South China Sea, the Malacca Straits, and takes it all the way to, in fact, to Europe as well. It goes through the Suez Canal and reaches Spain and Portugal. That's the Maritime Silk Road that they are trying to bring back into relevance. But is India sitting quiet? No, India is not. In 2015, India's current leadership, Prime Minister Modi, he came out with a doctrine called Sagar, Sagar. Now, Sagar in Chase Indian language means sea. Okay, Sagar means sea, SEA. But this Sagar is an acronym for security and growth for all in the region. Now, this is a very interesting concept because what is it that matters to any country in the world? Whether you are United States under Trump or whether you are, let's say, Rwanda under Paul Kagame. I'm just giving an example. Or maybe a Bangladesh or maybe a Pakistan. All that matters to you is security and growth. These are the two impulses for any nation. And the maritime domain will decide whether your security is taken care of and whether your growth is prosperous or not. Because everyone knows basically your security and growth comes largely from the maritime domain. It is shipping that basically makes you a world power. Now, the problem between India and China is that we share contested geographies. I call them contested geographies because we have a shared geography. Okay, so if you look at India and China, India and its neighbors, immediate neighbors, this region is called South Asia. So who are the Indian neighbors? Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives. These are India's 6 neighbors. India has a land border with Pakistan, with Nepal, with Bhutan, with Bangladesh. So let's look at only these countries. If you look at these countries, they also, excepting for Bangladesh, Nepal shares a border with India, but Nepal also shares a border with China. Bhutan shares a border with India, but it also shares a border with China. India shares a border with China, and Pakistan shares a border with India and also a border with China. So what it means is that China borders 4 countries of South Asia, including India. And it is also the largest trading partner of all the 7 countries. No surprise here. China is the largest trading partner of 130 countries in the world, right? And it's the largest trading partner of all the South Asian countries. Now, what does it do? It means that China is breathing down India's neck. Okay. So when India does something in its neighborhood, China says, look, I also matter because it's also my neighborhood. Of course, the legitimacy for that neighborhood does not exist. But geographically speaking, China makes the argument that what is your neighborhood is also my neighborhood. And so this is a shared geography. And that gives China this excuse, the logic, to say, look, I will do things in Nepal. I will do things in Pakistan. I will do things in Bhutan. But when they do those things raise serious security and economic considerations for India. And you have to take that into account. Let's look at the next point. India's manufacturing sector has been its weakest link. And again, the current government of Prime Minister Modi has been taking a lot of steps to grow India's manufacturing sector. This is a sector which has been in the doldrums for decades. And as a result of that, India's growth has been largely because of services. Everyone knows that. India is known to be a country of knowledgeable people, smart people. So they do a lot of things in technology, information technology. India is known as the pharmacy of the world. So when it comes to knowledge power, India is a top country, right? One of the best in the world. But the manufacturing sector and the production sector has been its weakest. So because of that, over years, what happened was India has a huge structural dependence on imports from China. And I mentioned there 120 plus items. Now, let me give you 2 examples, both on extreme ends of the spectrum. One is toys. We all play with toys. Kids play with toys. Is it so difficult to make toys in a country? But no, India did not make toys. India pretty much preferred to buy toys from China. And China is this market that can produce things for cheaper than anything. We've seen with DeepSeek as well, right? I mean, they're presenting DeepSeek as the latest AI platform, which has been built for a fraction of the cost that OpenAI has put in and Google is putting in. So in fact, China is telling the United States, you're spending billions on getting an AI platform. I have done this for just about 5 million. Now, can you, presuming it's true, we don't know if it's really true or China's lying to the world, but let's say it's true. Who is going to be able to, run down costs so low? It's just impossible. So in the field of toys, India is one of the big toy markets in the world. India has been dependent and billions of dollars of foreign exchange reserve goes in buying toys, which are then sold in the Indian market, Chinese toys in the Indian market. Of course, that's toys. Let's look at the other side, which is serious matter. During COVID, India realized that they are the pharmacy of the world. India made two vaccines, right? The only country in the world, apart from the United States, to have two vaccines of its own. One in collaboration, one of its own. And we were able to vaccinate our country faster than any other country in the world. And this is a big country of 140 crore people, 1.4 billion. About 1 billion had to be vaccinated, so two times over. Now, India did that again because India is a pharmacy power in the world. India produces a lot of vaccines for the world. But the problem is, India realized we are a vaccine and we are a pharmacy for the world only when we get these APIs from China, active pharmaceutical ingredients. These 70% of the world's APIs, which go into pharmacy and making of drugs and vaccines, come from one country, and that is China. Now, can you allow a regime like the one that we have in China right now to control 70% of the world's APIs? Literally, it is going to put the health of the world in the hands of one country. And this is a communist country. This is a country that largely thinks of its own self, right? Wants to dominate the world, is not necessarily multilateral or democratic. Are you going to allow this untenable situation to continue? So India has come out with a scheme called the PLI scheme, which is the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. And under that, they have identified about 15 sectors where if India puts its mind to it, over the next 5 to 10 years, India can become self-sufficient and reliant in these areas. And one of them is APIs. So already APIs are now, companies are coming forward to make APIs in India. And the belief is that 7 to 10 years from now, India will still need much lesser APIs from China. Maybe not zero, but we will need much lesser APIs from China. Now, this is just to give an example. On the toy industry as well, we have put in place a new policy trying to see how we can make toys. So I just gave you two extremes: toys, which is something very, very casual, but APIs, which is something very, very strategic. So India has structural dependence on China. And this makes India weak when it comes for negotiation with China. Let's face it, when it comes to building strategic infrastructure, there is no match for China. Yes, we can all talk of the debt issues and many other issues are there, and they are logical issues. But I'm only on the point of saying who can build the kind of infrastructure that China builds. Have you ever heard the Americans build anything in the last 50 years? Have we heard the Europeans build anything in the last 50 years? Nobody we have heard. And there are exceptions like Europe and Japan, which build fast trains and all. But if you leave them out, what has United States done? What has UK done? And India has struggled for a long time because we were not known as builders of infrastructure. Of course, things have improved now. Our companies are making airports. If you see in India, airports are one of the finest now, right? So our companies are emerging, building airports, we're building ports. So gradually India is now rising, and probably in 10 years' time, India is going to be able to be a strong power. But let me tell you one more thing. And I've mentioned there a policy called string of pearls. Now, if you could go to the next slide, just to show you what is string of pearls. Can we just go to the next slide for a bit? Yeah. Now, this is called string of pearls. Basically, what China is doing, and this is the entire maritime domain around India, those red dots are basically ports which China is either building or China is looking to control. Now, just look at them. There is Gwadar in Pakistan. There is Malé in the Maldives, which is again India's neighbor. There is a place called Hambantota, which is in Sri Lanka. That's another port which China has built. There is a port called Chittagong, which is in Bangladesh, again neighbor of India. There is, you can see there, it's written as Kyok, but it's Jokpyu, which is in Myanmar. Again, Myanmar is a neighbor of India. You can see Cambodia written there, CAM. They have a port in Cambodia, and they are now looking to build a canal in Thailand across the country by cutting the country into two. And in the Bay of Bengal, you can see a red dot that's called Coco Islands. Now, I'm not even going to something further like Bogamayo in Tanzania. I'm not going that far. We don't even need to go that far. Just look at what it looks like. Gwadar, Malé, Hambantota, Chittagong. It's like a necklace. So what is China doing here? China is building ports for its own sake because it wants to control the trade here. But these ports are dual use ports. They can be used for military purpose. They can also be used for commercial purpose. So they can switch between commercial and military anytime. That gives them real power in terms of either being economic in their goal, but if tomorrow they want to militarily take on India in the maritime domain, these ports will become very important for them. So India has known this, and India is building its own response. India is building its own response to the string of pearls. So let's go back to the slide, the text slide. Yeah. So please see that I mentioned string of pearls. So that was string of pearls, what I showed you. Now, what is that? It's what I call a sharp and smart power. In the world, we don't talk of only hard and soft power. We now say there is hard power, there is soft power, there is smart power, which is using your power very smartly, not wasting it, but there is sharp power. Sharp power is when you target your power on another country to make a big difference in your relations. That's called sharp and smart power. So India is pushing back against Chinese sharp and smart power. And the last point here is that how is India doing it? What is India's response? Well, India's response is first, we are building our own infrastructure in our neighborhood, but we are growing on it, but we are still, some distance away. But India has friendships with navies in the region. That's India's biggest plus point. Navies in the region and even in the Pacific don't want to work with China because there is a trust factor. China, and as I always say, in the previous slide I said, China has a lot of partnerships, but very few partners. I repeat, they have a lot of partnerships, but very few partners. That means the partnerships exist because countries just cannot go anywhere else, but they're not from the heart. Partners come only when they genuinely believe they can work with you. India has this big plus point. India can work with many countries in the region and beyond because we are a like-minded country to many countries in the world, because we don't go and dominate any country. We don't try to put countries down. Okay, let's go ahead. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. Now, this is a slide that tells you about non-traditional security threats. Now, we all understand there are security threats and there are non-traditional security threats. Now, why have I taken this particular slide? China was never an Indian Ocean power. China is a Pacific power. So when they began entering the Indian Ocean, it raised a lot of eyebrows. China's argument was, oh, look, don't get concerned about our role here. We are coming here because we have economic interests. As you can see, between Yemen and Somalia, that's what we call as the Red Sea area, right? That's from where the Suez Canal then goes up there. So China said, look, we are only here because our trade is here and we want to protect our trade, which is the legitimate, role of any country. Fair enough. Then we had this, Somali pirates issue between 2005 and 2010, when ships were being routinely seized by, Somali pirates. And this was a big issue. So as a result of that, the Chinese and a lot of Chinese ships were being interdicted. So China said, we are, sending our navy here to be able to control the piracy. Okay, they came in there. People thought they'll go back after the piracy is over. The piracy ceased to exist after 2010, but China's role in the region did not cease. So actually, China's entry into the Indian Ocean was on the back of an excuse like the Somali piracy issue. They made it an excuse saying, oh, look, we have to defend our economic interests. But even when piracy was over and the world was saying, look, let's collaborate and do things, you don't have to be here. You can work with like-minded countries. China has not left the Indian Ocean since 2005 and 2010. So they are now very much here, and they make all kinds of arguments to, legitimize their role. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So as I'm kind of, reaching the later half of my lecture, the most important factor driving India-China relations today is what we call as connectivity. Connectivity. Now, connectivity is important because if it can be physical connectivity, it can be digital connectivity, it can be people-to-people connectivity. Why is connectivity important? There are many parts of the world which are hinterland countries. They don't have maritime access. They have a lot of resources. Like I'll just give you an example, the port of Chankay, which is in Peru, right? Now, the first phase of the port of Chankay was inaugurated by Xi Jinping in October 2024 when he traveled to Peru and traveled to Lima for the APEC conference. Now, as the port of Chankay was, developing and materializing, President Lula, who traveled to, China last year, he actually met with Xi Jinping, and one of the things that President Lula mentioned to President Xi Jinping was, would you be considering extending the port? You'll be building the port in Peru, but would you be interested in extending from the port rail links and road links? That means create rail and road issues, which can go from Peru inside and can actually enter Brazilian hinterland. Now, what is the interest that President Lula has with this? This is specific. The Brazilians are on the Atlantic. That's because trade matters. The Indo-Pacific matters. Brazil realizes if it really has to grow itself and become the kind of powerhouse it wants to be, its markets are not in United States and Europe. Its markets are in the Indo-Pacific. Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, India, African countries, your China. So the heart of everything is the Indo-Pacific, and so he wants to connect the hinterland of Brazil to the port of Peru, which is on the Pacific side. So China has in fact told him we will do that. If that happens, a lot of Brazilian resources, which are cornered in the internal part of Brazil, which is away from the oceans, will now start moving to the port of Chankay, and from there will get exported to many Pacific countries. This is the power of infrastructure and connectivity. Where is Peru? And look who is making the demand. The demand is being made by the Brazilian president. So the first connectivity I want to talk about is what is called as Chennai Vladivostok. Because remember, wherever we talk about India, and China, the Russia factor is bound to come in. Russia has been a friend of both countries. Even today, Russia is a friend of both countries. And Russia stays out of any disputes between India and China. When the Galwan dispute happened 5 years ago, China told Russia, don't supply any military hardware to India. Okay, so they thought they will do that because they have a special relationship with Putin. India told Russia, supply it to us. Don't listen to China. Putin said, look, he told the Chinese, I'm not in this fight. This fight is between both of you. I am a friend of both. I am going to adhere by whatever agreements I have signed with India, because I can't stop them. If I stop them, it will mean that I'm favoring you versus India. So as a friend of both countries, let me export what I have to export to India, but I will not export anything more than what I have promised India. And I think some of you who might be very interested in international relations around the world, you would have seen the special relationship that Prime Minister Modi and President Putin have. They're always patting each other on the back and they're hugging each other. They have a really, really close relationship for the last 10, 11 years. Now, this connectivity matters a lot because it passes by China, as you can see. China is impacted by this connectivity. This is connecting the eastern part of India to the eastern part of Russia. The eastern part of Russia is very underdeveloped. Putin wants to grow that region. But he's not brought the Chinese into it because he's worried that China has intentions to swallow this part of Russia. If you've read about China, China has plans. China says that ultimately all these regions have to become part of China. It's a very expansionist notion. They say by 2065, they will take all this part you see, Vladivostok and that eastern part of Russia. They say all of that will be integrated into China. They say that Japan will one day cease to exist and will become part of China. That means they will actually make Japan a province of China. They will make South Korea a province of China. They will make North Korea a province of China. Now, this is expansionism. They even say that the Okinawa island that belongs to Japan will be swallowed up by them. They have an eye on India's, states, which they say they will one day unite. So Russia is very concerned about Chinese behavior. So Russia has brought in its trusted friend India into the picture. And this is the connectivity enterprise that we are doing. Now, there are other countries who are also interested in joining this connectivity. It's a shipping route. It's a shipping route that connects Chennai with Vladivostok. Many other countries want to be part of the shipping route. China is right now feeling very insecure by the shipping route, because this route will mean that Indian ships will keep moving up and down, but they can't oppose it because Russia is also their friend. So they can't afford to do something against Russia and draw Russia's ire. So they're looking at this, this whole enterprise, but they're not looking at it favorably. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is another important one that came up during, again, this has implications for China and in the India-China relationship. This is a corridor that was proposed by Prime Minister Modi during India's G20 summit in 2023. Now, if you can see, pretty much tomorrow night, I'm going to be in Greece. So I'm actually going to be very close to Piraeus, which is where I'm giving a lecture 3 days from now. So this is a route that links India, as you can see, Gujarat and Mumbai, two states of India on the west coast. It links it to Greece, that is Europe, basically, the starting point of Europe. So it's an India-Europe economic corridor which goes through Middle East or goes through West Asia. So from India, the shipping route goes to Jebel Ali, which is UAE. From there, it turns into a kind of a railroad. As you can see, the sea route then converts to a rail route. The rail route goes all the way up to Israel's port of Haifa, and then it again becomes a shipping route, and goods are traded to Greece. Now the point is, why am I talking about this? Where is the Chinese role here? The port of Haifa in Israel is 50% controlled by China, 50% by India. There's a Chinese firm that controls 50%. There is an Indian firm called Adani, which also controls 50%. Then the port of Piraeus. The port of Piraeus is controlled by China, 50%. Half of it is controlled by India. There's competition there as well. The port of Jebel Ali is a port that is basically of the UAE, which is operated by the United States. China has been desperately asking the UAE, can you transfer control of this port to us? Because China realizes the importance of the UAE port. But UAE, under pressure from the United States, has not done so. So China realizes that, look, this is a very important corridor which is developing, which is going to have implications for Chinese trade. Because as I told you, a lot of the Chinese oil comes from the Persian Gulf. A lot of Chinese goods move through these areas, through these water bodies. They move to Europe and they move to Africa and many other markets. So China feels constrained by these Indian options, which are now basically putting China on the back foot. Let's go to the next one. This is the third and last connectivity initiative I want to talk about. Again, this is important from China's point of view. This is connecting, as you can see, St. Petersburg on one side to Mumbai. Again, it's a connection between India and Russia, but this is a different part of the world, not the eastern part of the world, the western part of the world. This goes through Iran. Iran becomes the most important country for this connectivity. And as you can see, it's Mumbai to Iran by ship. Then it goes through, partly through rail, partly through road, and again connects all the way to St. Petersburg. And from St. Petersburg, it's possible to access all of Europe, right? You can go to the Nordics. You can also go to Central and Eastern Europe. So this is again an initiative that India has developed for connectivity, for goods to move. Now, what's the problem with China here? Well, what causes problem to China is this goes through parts of Central Asia. And Central Asia, that is Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all these stans as they call them, right? Uzbekistan. These stans are now under Chinese influence. China's influence is growing in this region. And China does not want an alternative connectivity, particularly driven by India. So it's been telling Russia for a long time, give up on this, give up on this. But Russia wants to maintain a very delicate balance. It doesn't want to lose India. It doesn't want to lose China. So Russia does a lot of things with China, but they also are ensuring that these connectivities operate with India. So these connectivities give India, of course, as and when they get completed, another 10, 15 years from now, they will give India real significant influence vis-a-vis China in a very important domain like connectivity. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, so this is my last slide, and then I'll be happy to take any questions. So how do we look at the whole India-China dynamic in the world? See, China is very clear. They want to have primacy over the world. They want to displace the United States, and everything that they do has that implication, right? What is India's view? Yes, India wants to reform the global order. We strongly believe, along with Brazil, along with South Africa and many other global South countries, we believe that the global order today is not just. There's no fairness in it. There's no democracy in it. There's no justice in it. But we don't want to bring down Western countries and rise. So our goal is reform the global order and global institutions through dialogue. That's why even recently, when BRICS was talking about its own currency, India said, look, pushing your own currency means you're trying to bring down the dollar. This will lead to a fight with the United States, and it's not good for global trade. Not only we said this, Brazil under President Lula also had a very similar view. In fact, Brazil joined India and said, India is right. We also believe that to grow your economy, you don't have to bring down the American economy. You can also find ways and means of working with the American economy, right? So that's the first point. When China pushes its economic and technological processes and systems, right, they create a division. They create a clear ideological division. So we are now seeing open AI, which is put by America. We are seeing DeepSeek, which is very Chinese. And you will never see open AI and DeepSeek ever working together, right? I mean, it's possible that OpenAI and Musk may someday work together, although they don't work together now. But it's impossible to see how a Chinese platform can work with an American platform, simply for ideological reasons. But India has no such problems. When India puts forward its technological governance platforms, and we have a platform called JAM, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and Mobile. Okay, Jan Dhan is creating financial accounts and bank accounts through financial systems and putting money into people's accounts directly through technology without any physical movement of money. Second is Aadhaar. Aadhaar is a biometric authenticated national identity that is applicable all over India, and it's allowed corruption to be checked in a very big way. So this is a governance solution. And of course, mobile. And the amount of cashless transactions which India does on a monthly basis, I'm quoting global figures, India does more cashless transactions every month than China, United States, and Brazil put together. And it's a fact. Even Chinese have been stunned by how much India now performs in the cashless system. You don't see anybody handling cash in India. Everything is now through the cashless payment system. Okay. China's infrastructure definitely creates huge opportunities for nations. There's no doubt about it, which is why nations go and adopt their own infrastructure. But it also creates a debt scenario. It puts these countries in debt. And then these countries are left paying money for many generations to come. And when they cannot pay money, China goes and takes control of their territories, right? They've done it to so many countries in Africa and South Asia. India, on the other hand, always says, if we build infrastructure, we will test the infrastructure on these principles. That means we will only build infrastructure if that infrastructure project is consultative. What is consultative? India will consult with the political leadership of that country. Do you really want this project? Then we'll build it for you, right? India says any project that India will build will be fiscally prudent. So if the finances don't work out, we'll not make it. We'll not put the country into debt. It should be environmentally friendly. You can't make projects which will create environmental disasters, not in today's world. And lastly, it should be grassroots sensitive. That means the local communities must be taken into confidence. Many times we build these large projects, and even in Latin America, we have seen this. A lot of people's resistance to projects because people are never taken into confidence. Somebody sitting, the elite sitting in the capital has decided, and then people are not given accountability, transparency, so people protest. So when India builds infrastructure, India does it this way. Okay. India wants reform of the United Nations. Brazil also wants it. Japan wants it. Germany wants it. We have a G4 in the world. What has China done? China does not want Japan and India to be part of the UN Security Council. They're very clear about it, but they don't say it. So what they do? They have created something called as a coffee club. Okay. Coffee Club is a group of countries who are spoilers for these countries. So Brazil is a member of the G4. So China goes and tells a Mexico that, look, you join the Coffee Club and you oppose Brazil. Say, why Brazil? Why not me? Make that argument. Japan wants to be in the G4, is in the G4. So South Korea is in the Coffee Club. Same logic. Okay. India is in the G4. Pakistan is in the Coffee Club. So China has created this Coffee Club to instigate these countries to make it difficult for the G4 to ever make it to the United Nations. So that's the differentiation. That's the issue again. Fourth, I mentioned about Russia, so I will not spend time much on it. Both countries are friends of Russia, but Russia has to find a delicate balance between going with India and going with China. So they adopt what is called as a dehyphenated method. What is dehyphenation? I deal with, it's just for example now, I'm dealing with two individuals. So let's say Anna and Carlos. If I'm dealing with Anna, it is different from my dealings with Carlos. And what I'm dealing with Carlos is different from my, dealings with Anna. So I am dehyphenated. Both should not say that, look, you should be dealing with us in a certain way. So that's how Putin does. And Putin succeeded in building friendship with both these countries across different measures. Then, Global South. This is Africa, Latin America in particular. China has a particular approach to the Global South, which is largely about imposing projects in the Global South. That's why many projects, for example, Nicaragua, China wanted to make a canal in Nicaragua. It was going to cost $48 billion. Now, you are in the region, you understand it. Is Nicaragua a country that can ever pay back $48 billion? As I jokingly sometimes say, even if Nicaraguans are born 48 times over, they will not be able to pay back 48 billion. I mean, their economy will not be able to survive 48 billion. And China was talking about a Nicaragua canal. So what will happen is, this is nothing but recolonizing the Global South. India does not suggest any such projects to anybody in the Global South. India says we will suggest projects which are empowering. They empower the grassroots, that kind of thing. The US factor is very important. When we talk about India, China, how can you not talk about the United States? And what's the problem here? Every time India and the United States are on a good footing, as recently Prime Minister Modi went and met President Trump, and the meeting was excellent from the Indian side and the American side, the Chinese always get irritated when they see India and the United States working together. Now, what's the problem here? The problem simply is because in the Chinese mind, they feel that India is being propped up as a counterweight to China by the United States. But that is a very simplistic understanding of the situation. India is not some small country that you can prop up. I mean, tomorrow if somebody says Brazil is being propped up, I think it's going to be ludicrous. Brazil, yes, Brazil has its problems, but Brazil is too big a country to be propped up by anybody. Brazil is a powerhouse of the Global South, like India is a powerhouse of the Global South. That's why we work together on so many issues. So to say that a country like Brazil, yeah, you may say it for let's say for a Nicaragua or a Panama, yes, you can say they are a prop, right? But Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, Turkey, these middle powers, they are props. So India and the United States have a strategic partnership. It is a global strategic partnership. And we believe that if India wants to achieve its goals, which is to become a developed nation by 2047, this is what Prime Minister Modi has laid before the country. We complete 100 years of independence. He says we should be a $25 trillion economy where our per capita income has to be higher, India's infrastructure must be better. And so for that to happen, if there is any one country in the world which can help us, because we are democracies after all, we bond together, we have our differences. We are not allies of the United States. We will never subscribe to any illegality that the United States does, but we work with the United States comfortably. The last couple of points is, just as America is important, the ASEAN countries are also important. And the ASEAN countries are basically Southeast Asian countries. Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, all of these countries, 10 of them. ASEAN region is important because China has a very solid relationship with them. It's based on trade, investment, culture. Okay, that kind of thing. But India also has a strong relationship with ASEAN countries. Again, India has strong cultural and diaspora links in ASEAN countries. India has religious links in ASEAN countries. Hinduism, Buddhism has gone to those places from India. And India also has a very working economic relationship with these countries. So ASEAN is the other factor in the India-China relationship. And my last point before I stop is that India and China, it's not like India and China have not tried to work together. They have tried. They've honestly tried. But it has not succeeded. And it's not succeeded because, as I mentioned here, way back in 2005 6, even much before Mr. Modi came to power, the previous government of India, they tried to tell China that, look, we both need oil, we both need gas, right? Why should we go separately to Central Asia and Latin America? Because these are the two places which have a lot of oil and gas. Central Asia has significant oil, and Latin America also has oil. So why should we go to an Ecuador individually? Who benefits? Ecuador benefits because Ecuador as a seller then can play one buyer against the other. If both the buyers go to Ecuador together and say, look, we want to buy your oil, we want to pitch for these oil projects, but we'll do it collectively, you will get a better deal. It was tried, but even if before it could happen, it collapsed. And that is because, and this is my last point, India and China both are developing countries, they are aspirational countries, they are countries that want to become rich and prosperous, which is fair enough for both countries. But the problem, as I go back to my first slide, the problem is both are different systems of functioning. One is a communist dictatorship that uses capitalism in the economic space and technological space, but is very opportunistic and self-interested. And the other is a glowing democracy, which will of course do things slowly. China does things fast. China can do things fast because they don't have to ask anybody, right? In our countries like Brazil, India, we have to work with local players. You have to work with different states. One man's, whim is not the answer. So things happen slowly in our part of the world. But when India does it does it the right way. And as they say famously in English, it is often said, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go long, then you must go together. So India believes that yes, China is going fast and so it's going alone, but we want to go longer and so we go with the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you a lot for this lecture. It was amazing. And for to continue to, I'm going to read some questions for you, Professor.
Yeah, sure.
So the first one will be, Professor, before I
Yeah.
ask my question, thank you very much for the coming to the Federal University of Pelotas. Feel free to come back often. My question is, how will India manage border conflicts with Chinese in the face of India's economic rise in the 21st century? How will both countries deal with this competition? Can BRICS Plus be an environment for cooperation between countries in this situation? What are the impacts of enlargement of BRICS to India especially?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think it's very important that we are speaking in Brazil, so BRICS should be talked about. In fact, Brazil is going to host the BRICS in July. Now, when we talk about BRICS, what was BRICS meant for? BRICS is a grouping that was always described as a grouping of emerging economies, right? Economies that are having a sunrise. That means economies whose future is ahead of them. But as I see BRICS expanding to new countries, I'm wondering, is that definition still holding? Or have we moved away from that definition? Because with no offense meant to Iran is a friendly country of India. We have a lot of connectivity with Iran. But when Iran is brought into a BRICS Plus, I'm wondering, how does Iran qualify as an emerging economy? By every stretch of imagination, Iran is an economy under sanctions. Iran has oil, but Iran has a lot of poverty. Iran has no skills, no technologies. It is not emerging. It doesn't have a young demography. It only has geography. So how does the bringing in of, let's say, an Egypt or an Iran or an Ethiopia necessarily make BRICS the kind of emerging economy grouping that it was. So my understanding is that this is becoming now less of an economic grouping, it's becoming more of a geopolitical grouping. Now, I have no problems if any grouping is geopolitical and geoeconomic. But my concern is, and this is what India also is experiencing now, that Russia and China are dragging BRICS into a situation where they want to make BRICS nothing but an anti American front. So, for example, they go and say, okay, let's do this against America. Let's make a separate BRICS currency. What does India say? India said, look, we are all for de-dollarization. That means dollar should be used less and other currencies should be used more. But India does not stand for replacement of the dollar with another currency. That is not going to help. It is only going to mean war in the future, currency war. So India says rather than talk about replacement of dollar with a BRICS currency, India's position, which of course is also Brazil's position and South Africa's position, we are for currency multipolarity. Currency multipolarity means we must have multiple currencies in the world. Let every country's currency grow the way that country would like it to grow. As the country's trade grows, the country's currency. So more currencies must be traded, and that way you bring de-dollarization rather than attacking the United States, because the United States is still the strongest country in the world. We have our trade links with the United States. So the BRICS had a great potential of doing a lot of good. They still have the potential to do good, but the concern is that BRICS's agenda has now drifted away from what it was way back in 2004, which is when Goldman Sachs talked about emerging economies. Today, it is becoming nothing but a grouping that comes and criticizes United States and Western countries. And that's why India, most of the time now, of course, participates in BRICS, but doesn't quite agree with every issue. And I'll give you one more example, how BRICS is a bit of an incoherence. In 2016, the BRICS summit was held in Goa, the place I come from, where I'm speaking now. And when Prime Minister Modi chaired the BRICS summit, he asked countries that, look, India as the chair has a prerogative of setting the agenda. So one of the things India wanted in that joint statement, which comes after the summit, India wanted a very crystal clear mention by all the BRICS countries, and this is when they were only BRICS, right? Not BRICS Plus, that BRICS countries are against terrorism of any and every kind. And India wanted the terrorist groups in Pakistan to be mentioned. China refused, Russia refused, Brazil refused, South Africa refused. All four countries said, China said, I don't face any terrorism, so why should I, agree to this? Brazil said, I don't face any Islamic terrorism. For me, all that I have is, gang wars and internal crimes. This is more a police issue rather than really a military issue. South Africa said, we have very similar problems. We have internal problems, not external problems. And Russia said, we have some Islamic problem, but it's not that big. So India wanted a certain approach. Other countries did not agree. Now, that's the problem that you will face when you start enlarging the BRICS. I fear that in the future, by the way, Saudi Arabia has not yet joined. They were offered. Argentina has walked out of BRICS after joining BRICS. So what may happen is you could have Iran's issues with the United States dominating the agenda of BRICS, and BRICS will get derailed. That's my problem. So I don't see the BRICS in the future, the way it's evolving and devolving, really playing that significant role in shaping the world, apart from, of course, being a protest movement against the United States.
Well, the second question will be thank you so much, Professor, for your presence at this event. I would like to ask which are the perspectives for India and Brazil cooperating for the future? In which way both countries can help each other on achieving further development?
Yeah, so India and Brazil have a lot of convergence in various areas. We have in fact been able to work together. So there are two or three areas. One area on which we have had long-standing collaboration since 2002, may I say, is in the whole issue of diversifying our energy requirements. Now, Brazil has been a pioneer in the field of ethanol, and we have also been looking to blend our petrol. We are a very big importer of crude oil, and a lot of our foreign exchange reserve goes there. Plus, it's very polluting for the environment. So we have been looking to blend ethanol in our petrol. For the last 10 years in particular, since Prime Minister Modi has come into office, we have managed to blend petrol to the extent of 15% ethanol in petrol. We want to take it to 25%. Brazil is a huge help because Brazil is a pioneer in this field. And let me tell you, we hosted the G20 in 2023, Brazil hosted it last year. Last year, when Brazil was hosting the G20, on the sidelines of the G20, there was a meeting between India's petroleum minister, that is the energy minister, and Brazil's energy minister. And we have put in place a special working group, India Brazil co chaired working group on ethanol production, ethanol storage, ethanol distribution, ethanol applications to make ethanol more integrated within the overall energy mix of India. And from there, other countries can also learn, and Brazil and India can jointly pitch this to the global south, because energy costs are a very big dampener of the global south. When you look at the global south budgets, a huge amount of the budget is spent on energy because we are energy intensive countries. We use a lot of energy. So we have to think out of the box as to how we can bring in this. So this is one area. The second area is, in terms of sustainable development, the Amazon is a huge plus. Now, yes, Brazil has huge problems with mining, but Brazil has also made headway in some aspects of sustainable mining. In fact, we are in talks right now with a couple of universities in Brazil to be able to launch courses on sustainable mining here in Goa, because my state of Goa is also a mining state. They do a lot of mineral ore prospecting that they do here. So there is a lot of scope for India and Brazil to mutually learn when it comes to things like sustainable use of its natural resources. Brazil, of course, has also the Amazon, and the Amazon are the lungs of the earth. Now, the carbon sink that the Amazon is of course fascinating. But Brazil has been able to help India in terms of spatial imaging of the Amazon. Now, we have very, very big, dense forests in India. And these forests have also been a security threat because we have a certain movement, a communist movement, armed resistance, like you have had for long years in Colombia, something like the FARC, but not quite there. Something like the FARC has gone on now for the last 40 years in some parts of India. And this is an armed resistance which uses terrorism and wants to overthrow the state. We have used technology that Brazil has offered us because Brazil has technology to map dense forests. And this has been used by our security forces to be able to overcome some of these challenges, forced by these groups. And I can happily relate that we have been able to reduce this scourge of terrorism to a very small extent, and a major role has also been played by Brazil. But having said that, I would not say only India and Brazil can do things. India and Brazil have the potential, because we regardless of who is in power, whether it was Bolsonaro before, Lula now, Dilma before that, the good thing is India, Brazil have a bipartisan friendship. So whoever is the leader in India or Brazil, we believe in this relationship and we take it forward with new achievements. India and Brazil can actually drive many areas of sustainable growth. For example, in 2005, the then Indian government sent a delegation to Brazil to study the Bolsa Familia program that was launched, of course, by then President Lula when he was president. Because at that time, the conditional benefit transfers, the conditional cash transfers that Brazil was doing was applauded by the United Nations Development Program, which said that Brazil's program is a pioneer in the field of financial inclusion, poverty alleviation, bringing incomes to poor people, and addressing issues like school dropouts, etc. A delegation from India came to Brazil to study this particular thing, went back with recommendations, and implemented what is called as the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act program. We have something called as the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. This act provisions in the entire scheme has been drawn up on the lines of what Brazil did with Bolsa Familia. So There are many areas where there are mutual learnings between India and Brazil that go from energy to financial inclusion to security management. And the learning can be both sides, because India is offering, for example, I still don't forget this, that Indian pharmaceutical sector was able to make its entry into Brazil only because when Lula was president the first time around, he said, can we look at Indian pharmaceuticals entering Brazil to provide for antiretroviral drugs against HIV? So I remember Prime Minister Vajpayee invited Lula for the as a Republic Day chief guest in India. In the meeting, they agreed that Indian pharmaceutical sector will make an entry into Brazil. India has many, many fantastic pharmaceutical sector companies. They made entry into Brazil, and today they are well established in Brazil. And not just in Brazil, they've expanded across the length and breadth of Latin America. And they're making very good margins and very good bottom lines. So India provides IT, India provides software, India provides knowledge base, India provides pharmaceuticals. Brazil also provides its own way of in terms of energy security, etc. So there's a lot that India and Brazil can do together.
Well, the third question would be, Professor, thank you for your
Yeah.
lecture. It was very enlightening. I have a question. Last year, the petroleum agreement between China and India was announced. Would this represent progress in resolving borders disputes, or it is limited to land borders and specific regions, given to China's primary interest in lies in maritime borders? My second question also concerns about border disputes. What are the possible scenarios regarding the Kashmir region, considering China also has a presence there?
Yeah. So two very interesting questions. The first one, I'll take the second one first. Look, China is a part of Kashmir because of two reasons. One, a part of Kashmir was transferred to China unilaterally by Pakistan in the 1960s, around the 1965 war. But recently, China has made an entry into Kashmir by basically transgressing or violating a core principle of international law. China has built the China Pakistan, or they are actually building, if I may say so, the China Pakistan Economic Corridor. Now, this corridor extends from Kashgar, which is in western China, to Gwadar, which I had shown you on one of my maps. Now, the problem is the trajectory of this particular economic corridor crosses through what is called as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. This is that part of Kashmir which Pakistan has illegally occupied after 1947 and has held on to it. So India has made this point to China very often that regardless of whatever grounds you may have, what you have done is a violation of international law, because this is a territory that is ours, that is held illegally by Pakistan. Whatever you may say, it is disputed territory. When two people are disputing a territory, there is no way that a third person can build something in that territory and become a party to that territory. So China is an illegal, participant in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Now, what is the game plan here? India understands the game plan. The game plan is very simple. Pakistan has been very concerned about the current government in India, because the current government of India and Prime Minister Modi is a very dynamic leader. He has taken some tough security measures to deal with this situation. And so Pakistan realizes that even Indian action to free Pakistan occupied Kashmir is quite possible, because India's military is getting stronger, India's economy is stronger, and Pakistan's falling by the wayside. So the gap between India and Pakistan is widening in terms of comprehensive national power. So the only way that Pakistan feels it can hold on to Kashmir is by bringing the Chinese in and getting them to illegally build things in Kashmir. What it has done, it has now made this whole problem, of course, legally speaking, it is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. But forget legally, on the ground, it has now become a trilateral issue, with China also becoming a part of it. And the belief is that if India takes any action, precipitous action in Kashmir to free Kashmir from the clutches of Pakistan, China will step in, because Chinese interests, Chinese infrastructure will be hurt, and China will then step in. So Pakistan knows that it could end up becoming, not just an India-Pakistan war, it could become an India-Pakistan and an India-China war, which India will not want. India cannot afford that because right now our whole focus is on growing our economy. We want to grow our economy at about 7 to 8% for the next 20 years. So we go from 4.5 trillion to something like 12 to 15 trillion in the next 20 years, if not in the next 30 years. Okay, so that's about Kashmir. Now, coming back to the India China thing, yes, see, why was Galwan important? What happened 5 years ago? Since 1975, there was no physical, injury or death to any soldier between India and China on the border. So 1975 to 2020. So for 45 years, this border, which is very hot, it's not a cold border. It's not like North Korea and South Korea, which is a frozen border at the 38th parallel. This is quite a hot border. There are many contested areas in different sectors where India and China have patrolling claims. But patrolling has tended to be peaceful. Patrolling was never in terms of weapons, and they were lightly armed weapons. Okay, you could never take heavily armed weapons. This particular issue was in a sense broken. China broke the law. China broke the kind of implicit agreement that there would be no arms used. They came with all kinds of cruel weapons, which could tear your skin off and whatnot, right? And they used it against Indian soldiers. So clearly, China was trying to exploit the situation, looking at the fact that COVID has happened and trying to give India a bloody nose. Now, why does this happen? And I go to China very often. I meet a lot of Chinese scholars. They have been very concerned about how India is now building its border infrastructure. There was a time when the gap between India and China in terms of border infrastructure was almost incomparable. China was streets ahead in terms of their technology and their defense and their border construction, road construction, and India was fledgling. But in the last 10 years, what Prime Minister Modi has done, and it's been phenomenal in the country, the pace at which India is building highways and roads is a total, even the Chinese are watching, right? And the main thing was to address this huge gap with regard to border infrastructure. Now, the more India began to do this, the gap between India and China began to narrow. And that makes China disconcerted. China is uncomfortable because their natural advantage now is reducing. So when they see their advantage going down, they wanted to give India a bloody nose and to kind of tell India that, look, if you don't behave yourself, we'll sock you. Now, what happened was they faced a resistance from India that they never imagined. And our soldiers, and for the last almost 3.5 to 4 years, Indian soldiers have been holding guard at very harsh temperatures, inhospitable terrain. And the Chinese thought India will walk away. India stood firm for 4 years, did not move and did not flinch. Ultimately, China realized they needed to back down. Now, my point is, this is the land border, but this is not the most critical element of India's national security. India's national security is more critically impacted by what happens in the maritime domain of India, around India's neighbors, in the waters of India. That is where the Chinese are getting extremely aggressive, but in a subtle way. They are sending their surveillance ships to the region. We have in fact noticed 4 surveillance ships that have come last year in the Indian Ocean. They come to Sri Lanka, but they are a surveillance ship. They dock in Maldives, but they are doing surveillance on India. They come near Andaman Nicobar Islands, which are our islands and which we are developing into a tri-services base. They use the Coco Islands, which is Myanmarese islands. They use the Coco Islands as a listening post. So, while patrolling arrangements on the border now have been have begun to resume on the land border, but we are cautious about it. It is the real problem is really how do you deal with the maritime domain and how do you deal with the maritime issues that China poses. So China poses a tremendously big threat in terms of surveillance, in terms of reconnaissance. They have underwater drones, that lurk around your submarines. China's biggest problem that countries face from China is what is called as IUU fishing, which is illegal, unauthorized and unregulated fishing. And China is in fact, Latin America knows it very well. Ask the Ecuadorians. The Ecuadorians will tell you that the Chinese are always there with their ships and their boats, their fishing militias around the Galapagos Islands. So, when it comes to ecological biodiversity protection, when it comes to fishing deposits, when it comes to mineral resources, there are serious threats being posed by China, and this is something that will have to be dealt with along with the land borders. So, land borders is a different kettle of fish, but the maritime borders are, or the maritime frontiers are a very different kettle of fish as well.
Well, thank you, Aloy. And that were the last question we had. We wish we had like more time to keep going talking about, but since you can see, it's possible to see from the question that the lecture were not so good only for me, but also for the other ones who are watching. All the time they are thank you, saying how wonderful this lecture is. So once again, our academic, our university want to thank you for the presence. It's such an honor to have a person like you here talking to us, giving you this wonderful lecture. Okay, so thank you a lot. This is such good. As far we are, this is the second time we're here, and still such a pleasure. Such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure as well to be with you.
So thank you, guys. The last lectures will be, no, the lectures will be in a presential form. So I'll wait you guys there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to know you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.